We're recording. All right, great. We're back. Welcome back. Good to see everybody. Hello to the folks in the online section as well. So announcements, nothing really new other than just a reminder that Exam 1 is out there. It's been out there for a little bit. Hopefully you've had a chance to at least take a look at it so that if you have questions, now is as good a time as any to ask me if you've got them. The thought on that is, I think I said Friday before midnight, and that shouldn't be too difficult, I don't think, because it's only 2 questions, and it's really kind of straight out of Feldman sort of stuff. So no surprises, but getting the details right is kind of important to me, and it should be to you as well. So there's that. Haven't released the new discussion board yet because based on the progress through Chapter 4, it's a long chapter, and there's a lot of stuff in there to think about and to go over. I think I'm going to hold off, and that's fine. It'll work out pacing-wise. So I'll keep the current discussion board open for people who need to post or post more. I encourage you to do that. I've been enjoying reading them and sort of seeing what people are thinking about foundationalism and coherentism in general. Questions from you guys before we, hopefully you talk more about foundationalism. All right, so far so good then. So last time we were starting to get into Chapter 4, right? And I just wanted to see if people had any leftover questions. I know Corey and I talked a little bit, and in the very beginning there's that stuff about hasty and careful, right? In the very beginning of Chapter 4. We didn't really spend a whole lot of time on that. I think the point of Feldman's example there is to sort of motivate the idea that there does seem to be a case for epistemic justification, right? There's something that the one person has that the other person doesn't, and that seems to license or legitimate claims to know, right? That's, I think, the basic idea there. Last time I did talk a little, so thoughts?
I mean, yeah, it just seemed, mainly that subjective point, because
we can take a look back at it, too, if people want.
I mean, it talks about hasty and careful, and that kind of makes sense, but then we talk about the optimistic pattern and the terminally ill patient.
Well, so I've got these guys up here, too, right, from last time.
And like I was saying, it seems to be subjective, because according to Clifford, I would say, well, that's not, you shouldn't believe that, because that is not sufficient evidence for belief.
Right.
But it's, I don't get the whole harm versus versus good. Like it's doing better to believe than not to believe. It seems very subjective. Or what is.
Okay. Yeah, this is all good stuff. I mean, it's fair. So I mean, other people want to sort of piggyback in on that, because I mean, I need feedback from you to know how many people are sort of following what's going on there. We talked about it a little bit last time, but I'm happy to say more about it. Right? Yeah.
I don't think that epistemic justification is subjective. I think that what was up for debate was whether the moral justification was what was on point with the point that you made. It's always wrong to not believe something for lack of evidence, or to believe something for
on insufficient evidence. Yeah. Right. So I mean, it seems like really I should just turn it over and let you guys sort it out. It seems like. I mean, maybe you'll end up agreeing. I don't know. So I mean, there's this, Clifford has this famous quote, right, up there at the top, and it gets cited a fair amount, this idea that it's wrong always, everywhere, for anyone to believe on insufficient evidence, and as good philosophers who are concerned with the pursuit of the truth and knowledge, wisdom, right? That seems like something you'd want to kind of, yeah, that sounds right. It's a good idea. And yet, it seems like we can come up with these examples, right? Feldman gives us 3 there, where it's not entirely clear what the person in those examples ought to do. And Feldman has a kind of strategy that he wants to invoke, right, for dealing with this. He sort of wants to say, well, when we talk about the ethics of belief, it's a little different than the ethics of moral obligation, and that we can evaluate, if it turns out that beliefs, if there is a moral dimension to believing, if it can be morally wrong for a person to hold a belief, then that's a separate kind of issue. And that in itself is a really fascinating subject when you think about it, right? There might be disagreements, I'm sure there would be, about whether it's the case that it's morally wrong to have a certain belief. you may say, well, insofar as beliefs motivate action, right? I mean, they're not just sitting there. Presumably they have some causal power, and it's in part, if not large part, based on what people believe that they act the way they do. One would think, right? That's kind of the folk that's the folk picture, at least. So insofar as having certain beliefs can lead to really bad outcomes, then you might think, yeah, there is a moral dimension to believing, which is a fair topic to think about as well. But it seems like Aaron's saying that we can still assess the epistemic credentials without having to worry about this moral concern. And I don't know if what you were saying was,
I mean, no, that's along those
is
lines.
it different?
Because it seems to me like there's some sort of, like, you have to differentiate somewhere along the line of, like, is this a moral thing, or is this, like, an actual, like, epistemic or
practical.
Practical.
Yeah.
But just thinking about it, I can say, well, I've looked at the studies, and they say that I should believe that, because if I believe it, I'll get better and have a good attitude about that. Is that
right.
moral, or is that like an evidentialist, like, belief?
Is it supported by your evidence?
Yeah, is that supported by my evidence?
Presumably in this recovery example, it's not. Right? That's the, I'm seeing, I want to get sorry, yeah. Anthony.
Consider maybe like a out of the jurisdiction of epistemology to determine whether something
I'm going to slide over.
Yeah.
I can see you. That's cool. You're good, Trey. Yeah, all good. So say again, please.
I feel like it would be a bit out of the jurisdiction of epistemology to determine something like Clifford's thesis.
Mm-hmm.
Something wrong or right.
Seems like it should be in ethics.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like truth value sort of.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, it's weird, right? Because again, I guess the argument, the response is supposed to be, well, it really a lot turns on whether there is an ethical dimension to believing or a moral dimension to having beliefs. And I'm sympathetic to the idea that insofar as they can have really bad consequences and affect other people, people get, crazy beliefs and then they do kind of crazy things, then having certain beliefs might be the sort of thing that's morally evaluable. But certainly in a case like the recovery case, right? I mean, so just to get the setup out in front of us again, right? The idea is that the person's got this horrible diagnosis, all the evidence, the scientific stuff, whatever, suggests that the chance of recovery is very slim. Looks like on pure evidentialist grounds, they're not justified in believing that they'll recover. But then we add to the mix the fact that they're a normal human being who's just been given a terrible diagnosis, and like any of us in that situation, they'd want to do everything they could to give themselves the best possible, prognosis. And part of that might be believing that you're going to get better. And I guess it's a secondary, sort of issue. It's not something we have to decide here, but my guess is there's probably some good empirical data that suggests that people who have positive attitudes and think they're going to beat the illness and believe, try to stay. I mean, it makes sense too, right? You could tell a story about that. It has ultimately some effect on one's, maybe immune system or resiliency, whatever. So, what should the person do? And I mean, the way I think of it in a way similar to Rich, I think, which is that when we ask what the person should believe, it seems like we're asking. It could be asking a lot of different questions there, right? What should they believe from the purely epistemic point of view? What should they believe from the standpoint of morality, assuming that believing has a moral dimension, which is debatable, right? I mean, there are folks that are skeptics about morality when it comes to action, so they're just bound to be skeptical about beliefs, maybe, in part because perhaps you think they're not up to you, that believing isn't something that's under direct voluntary control, and if it's not up to you in the relevant respect, then you can't be held morally responsible for it. So then it looks like you're not morally responsible for your beliefs. And another question, of course, might be, well, what should you believe from the practical standpoint? Self-interested concern, right? So those are at least kind of three senses right there. And you may think that, well, I'm not completely convinced Feldman's way out's going to work here. It seems too good to be true. But it does seem like this notion of should is plausibly ambiguous between a bunch of different senses of should. And so the solution, if it is one, right, is, well, from the practical, self-interested, prudential standpoint, the only things that you're concerned with are, from that standpoint, are your own well-being, what's going to benefit you the most, right? We can all understand that the person ought to believe they're going to recover. But from the purely epistemic point of view, which is centered on truth, considerations that only have to do with whether or not the claim in question is likely to be true, looks like they shouldn't. And then you might say, well, so how do you break the tie? Right? Is there an what they call all-in, all things considered sense of what you ought to do? I don't know that I have a lot more to say. Yeah, all right.
The question I have about evidentialism is that if the evidence is always weighed by the total evidence, that is, the evidence that is available to the person, if a person isn't seeking any more evidence, they want to believe what they already believe,
Yeah.
and they aren't trying to prove their own belief wrong, then they're still justified in believing their superstition, or whatever, because they haven't sought evidence that is available to everyone else, but if they haven't collected it for themselves, they're still justified to believe their superstition, right? Because they haven't collected that.
Yeah, thanks. So just to repeat for other folks out there. So the worry is, Aaron's got a good point here, which is that suppose you've got somebody who's stopped searching for evidence, or they've just kind of shut down and they're no longer paying attention to new information, and they've got, let's suppose, a stock of sort of superstitious beliefs. Wouldn't evidentialism imply that they can stay justified as long as they like, when what maybe armchair sort of analysis, what we would want to say is, well, no, they need to be open and responsive to new information and, pay attention maybe to what some of the best science or whatever, right, the experts are saying, and then they'd be forced, if they were wanting to be evidentialists, they'd be forced to change their beliefs. And I think your take on it seems right to me. I mean, you may say, well, that's a big problem for evidentialism because there's nothing built into the theory to motivate people to seek new information or to make sure they're up with the latest, current, what would current evidence suggest. It sounds a little bit like the get the evidence principle that we can talk about when we look at that example, the movie times example, right? But so are you thinking this is bad news? I mean, I think you're right. That's the way to understand evidentialism.
Yeah, but I didn't really like to get the evidence principle.
Yeah, no, that seems like a bad idea. Well, it seems like a good idea to be open to new evidence, but it also there's a lot of worries about that, right? I mean, because we're all in that predicament all the time. So you're trying to form a belief on some topic, and you think about the evidence that you've got available to you, and then it occurs to you because you've been sitting in on this class, right, that maybe I should get more evidence. I mean, after all, there's just bound to be other things, other considerations. And so you start reading on the internet, and then you're off to the races, right, at that point, because it's a bottomless pit. And then you start realizing that there's conflicting voices out there. So you can find somebody who's going to support and say whatever. So it raises a lot of worries, that's for sure. I don't think that's very satisfying. I mean, I'm not saying anything that you haven't already kind of said, other than that I think that is, it's a feature of evidentialism, that there's no built-in kind of motivation for people to do better epistemically. But you can look at it the other way, too, which is that it allows us to be able to explain why people who don't have access to the evidence, let's suppose, take an example, ancient times, go back to ancient times. So what is it that makes the ancients justified in believing that the earth is flat? Well, it's that all the evidence available to them at the time suggested that that was true. We now, because we think we've got more information, right, know that that's not the truth, and so we're not justified in believing that, but we can tell a story that I think, so there are advantages to being able to point that out, right? And after all, what would we want them to do? The best that they can. But similarly, I do worry about your kind of case, where somebody's sort of intentionally not allowing themselves to be aware of additional evidence to the contrary. So good. So, I mean, what do people think about, I don't know if we've talked about the recovery example, right? The optimistic batter, similar kind of thing, right? Chest pains. All of these work in the same way, right? I mean, so they're supposed to present a kind of objection here to this idea of Clifford's thesis, and Feldman has a way of trying to finesse it, whether it works or not. Thoughts? Alrighty, well, on to the next little bit here. So we've got that. So I think the next thing, I want to say something about this. So I talked a little bit last time, but it wasn't entirely clear to me that people got it, or maybe still had questions about it. So just how we're formulating evidentialism, and then this distinction between evaluating a belief in terms of whether it's justified or not. So just talking about the epistemic status of believing, but not assuming that the person has the belief in question. Right? So this whole top level right here, I take this to be the primary notion of epistemic justification. This is what I'm mostly concerned with. When we're talking about whether a belief that's actually formed and held is justified, we often use these kinds of locutions, right? But these imply that the person has the belief, whereas the upper tier doesn't. And I mention this in part because later when we talk about reliabilism in Chapter 5, some objections to internalist theories of justification, the kind that we're considering now, seem to me to turn on a kind of confusion, a sort of conflation between these two ideas. Now, the way Feldman ends up, and so EJ at the top here, EJ is designed to sort of be, to capture evaluations using this kind of language. Right? So, in other words, the attitude of believing, disbelieving, or suspending, that attitude would be the one that's appropriate for the person to take from the epistemic point of view, if and only if the belief is supported, right, or not supported, or their evidence is neutral. So that's the idea where this is kind of the core concept. But there is this other concept. Let me show you that. Be nice if I had it all on a single frame here. But this lower level, so S is belief, right? This stuff, this is captured by this idea right here, WF, this well-foundedness principle. Evidentialism affirms both EJ and WF, right? It can work either way, but hopefully you kind of see the difference, because here's the thing. Suppose we've got a case where somebody's got all the evidence in the world for believing some proposition, right? I've got a lot of evidence for believing the thermos is on the table, let's say, right? And I go ahead and form that belief, but let's suppose that I don't use my evidence in forming it. I call the witch doctor, or consult the tea leaves, or shake the magic 8-ball, whatever. Form my belief that way. Clearly, that belief, even though it's epistemically justified in the sense of being supported by my total evidence, because I didn't use the evidence in forming the belief, it's not well-founded. So I'm not going to be harping on this idea of WF, although at least one kind of objection to foundationalism that Feldman considers, he does make a switch from talking about what the person would be justified in believing to whether or not a particular belief they've got is actually justified. But I do think it's worth people sort of seeing the difference here. So this second clause is designed to make sure that the person uses the actual evidence that they've got in forming the belief. And whether or not they do that, presumably, is going to be a contingent empirical matter, right? It's a causal matter having to do with the actual, mechanisms whereby they got the belief. And some, we'll see in Chapter 5, some epistemologists think that that's really the direction we ought to go, that epistemology should be focused on finding out these causal mechanisms, the neurological mechanisms, rather than just trying to do the analysis of the pure concept. All right, so that gets us to two initial objections to evidentialism that I think we can think about. And just to have them in front of us, anybody want to help us out here and read one? Get some student reader volunteers. It's on 47, the epistemic irresponsibility. I know somebody's just dying to read. Jamie, thank you. I appreciate that. Participation points. Thank you, yes. Cool.
A professor and his wife are going to the movies to see Star Wars Episode 68. The professor has in his hands today's newspaper, which contains the listing of the movies at the theater and their times. He remembers that yesterday's paper said that Star Wars Episode 68 was showing at 8. Knowing what movie usually showed at the same time each day, he believes that it is showing today at 8 as well. He does not look in today's paper. When they get to the theater, they discover that the movie started at 7:30. When they complain at the box office about the change, they are told that the correct time was listed in the newspaper today. The professor's wife says that he should have looked in today's paper, and he was not justified in thinking that it started at 8.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it. So this isn't too far from Aaron's earlier point, right? I mean, this is kind of connected in a way. And you said you don't like to get the evidence principle. So how do we fix this earlier problem you've mentioned about people being closed off to?
Well, I don't think he was being closed
You know,
off.
he was just he was following us, So that'd be a different kind of case a little bit, but in any case, so people see how this works, right? So the idea is, well, look, I mean, you've got the evidence that you've got, but maybe, I mean, the example's supposed to be one making us think that evidentialism's told him to do something he shouldn't do, when in fact what he should have done is follow this principle right here, right? We can read it. If S's actual evidence supports P, but S should have had additional evidence, then this additional evidence would not support P. Then S's belief's not justified. So, I mean, in what sense, I wonder, are the people who are closed off to new information, the worry there is that their evidence doesn't support it to start with? Is that the concern? So, okay, there may be a way to finesse that. So what do people think? Buying the example? Not a counterexample to evidentialism, or are people sympathetic to this? I mean, it's always easy in hindsight, right? Looking backward to say, well, if only I had looked a little deeper into this. Yeah, Anthony.
I mean, how much evidence is enough evidence? I guess.
Yeah, just the right amount.
Yeah.
That's what I want to say, but it's not satisfying.
So if you looked in the newspaper and it said 7:30, why would he believe that and stop there? Why would he follow up with that and figure out when the time actually is by asking more and more and getting more evidence pulled up?
Yes. So help me out. Say again. Like, what's the worry? I mean, so he's checked, right? But he hasn't checked it recently enough. Or,
yeah, it's like.
We all do this all the time, though, right? Because it's, you go to your favorite coffee shop, and every day that you've gone, and you've gone a lot in the past, they've always had your favorite coffee, right? That was one of the choices. And you have every good reason for thinking that that it'll be that way when you get there today, and then you get there, and it's not. So in that case, I'm inclined to think it goes the same way. I'm justified based on my evidence in thinking that my favorite coffee is going to be there. It just turns out that today is that exceptional day where they've run out. So are we on the same page then, or are you thinking, no, he's made a mistake with the times? I mean, yeah, well, it's always frustrating to turn out to be wrong, but being wrong is not the same as being irrational or being unjustified, right? And that happens a lot too. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think he's wrong. I think
Right.
you go to sleep at night, just thinking your refrigerator's running, you don't just have to check in the middle of the night to make sure your eggs aren't going to go bad in the morning.
Right.
And when you're driving through a green light, you don't just stop to make sure that nobody's going to blow a red light, even though that would save your life if it happens to happen.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, Jamie.
Yeah, also, Feldman talks about it too, like, he goes into like, you could keep having more justification and then, calling ahead and then asking the movie theater, like,
Right.
at what time, and then calling again to make sure that, like, the recording of your conversation that you did.
Right.
And so it's basically like, how far do you have to keep going?
Seems to be no end in sight, right?
Yeah.
And that's a worry too. And maybe you've had some of these. I mean, this isn't that far from some reality, right? From some practical sort of situations. I feel like I get in those conversations with my mom as an example, because we'll have conversations and she'll want to know, well, did you check this? And yeah, I checked that. Well, what about? Well, you remember last time and so you get in this cycle where it seems like no amount of additional checking and verification is going to satisfy. Some of this is just anxiety, right? People get worried about things, and obviously depending on what the stakes are. I mean, this is maybe to your kind of earlier point, but if you're wrong about the movie times, the fate of the world doesn't hinge on that, right? So you missed it, you go back the next day, whatever. You're wrong. If you're wrong, suppose the situation's different. Suppose you're a school bus driver with a bus full of kids, and you're getting ready to go across a bridge, and there's been freezing rain, and the bridge is an old bridge, and the weather's not been good, and there maybe the right thing to do is to give more pause, more consideration to your overall evidence. But again, I don't think there's any easy principle here. There's no amount of additional reflection that's going to guarantee that you get it right. I mean, because I'm assuming that your evidence isn't conclusive evidence, right? And even then, if it were possible to have conclusive evidence, but you misevaluated yours, I mean, maybe you've got it but don't think you do, right? Or you don't but think you do. So I mean, there's that component that he hasn't really talked a whole lot about here, but that's built into the picture as well, that people can misevaluate their own evidence. So I guess the point is that if I were the school bus driver, I might at that point decide it's better to pull off to the side here, call for additional thoughts from the dispatcher, whatever, before I go across the bridge with a bus full of kids in the situation described, because in part the consequences of being wrong are a lot greater, and that to me seems to matter a little bit. But there's no principle, additional supplemental principle or auxiliary thing built into this that says anything like that. That's just stuff I know from having talked with people. Yeah.
So would we say that like the higher the stakes, the more like justification you would essentially need?
I'm tempted by that, but I don't want to go on record as defending the view. I want to think about it more. I want to get more evidence. But yeah, I'm inclined to think that because I think that's a hard and a good question, right? Like, how much justification do you need? And that's really a thing people want to know. And I wish and I know from talking with Rich and Earl and other people that they'd like to be able to say something more satisfying too, right? And it just seems to me, in thinking about it, that that's a big consideration. What are the consequences of being wrong? If the consequences of being wrong are catastrophic, then maybe, imagine if you're responsible for maintaining airplanes. You work at the airport, right? I know some folks that do this, and, that's a really high-stress job, and there's a lot at stake there. So if the weather's bad and, there's icing, you need to make sure the plane's properly de-iced. And how long ago did you do it? Did you do it 50 minutes ago or 15 minutes ago? The details make a difference here because the consequences are so, are so dire if you're wrong. So I'm inclined to think that some sort of context-dependent sliding scale. Again, I don't think there's necessarily any formal way to try to put a measure on it. It would be, you'd have to pick some values and index them to whatever it is, and that'd all be contingent, I suppose, as well. A good question. Yeah. So, other thoughts on I mean, this is fun stuff to think about, at least. So it doesn't seem like the get the evidence principle, though it's compelling, is first of all, evidentialism doesn't say that, right? And there would be this worry that you'd get caught in a loop and never be able to get out. What about loyalty? Somebody want to read us that one just so we can all have heard it? It's over on 49. Another one that's kind of interesting, right? Presents a little bit of a different kind of dilemma. Yeah, thanks, Corey.
The accusation. If your friend is accused of a crime and you are aware of some incriminating evidence, you also know this friend well and have evidence that committing such a crime would be out of character. Your friend is terribly distressed by the charges brought against her, and she calls you for support. Out of loyalty to your friend and given the mixed quality of your evidence, you believe that your friend is not guilty.
Yeah. All right, so what's the worry there? What should you do again, right?
It sets you up, though. Because
Yeah.
like in that, you should obviously get more evidence. But that's
Sure.
like a softball for that.
I mean, so you think that? So I mean, but evidentialism doesn't necessarily have to give the wrong result here, right? I mean, so let me just make sure I'm on the same page. You're thinking in a situation as described, the right thing for you to do would be to suspend judgment, neither believe they're guilty nor believe they're not.
If this was the rational place, that's what I would do. I would suspend.
You would suspend, yeah. But I notice everybody nodding, like, yeah, suspending, that sounds like the right thing. But the problem is we don't want to just suspend forever either. I mean, if we had to, because that were really our epistemic circumstance, then that's what evidentialism would say, and we'd have to settle in with it. But I'm inclined to think that, again, this is just kind of armchair stuff, and I'm happy for people to disagree with me here. That's part of what makes it fun. The cases, I think it's easy to use suspending as a way of never having to commit to belief or disbelief, right? But the cases where you really have to suspend are supposed to be ones where the evidence really is completely counterbalanced. There's either no evidence either way, or the evidence in favor is completely neutralized by the evidence against, and that's not always the case, right?
But doesn't that bring up the whole thing, like, can you epistemically justify the whole morality? Because it brings into question the morality of thinking about your friend being guilty or not guilty, which seems to be more of like that's a very difficult question to like epistemically, like, how do you deal with the morality of it?
Yeah, so I mean, what's the question about, I guess, loyalty to a friend, right? I mean, and any of us can relate to that situation, maybe. I mean, you'd be torn, right? I mean, you wouldn't want to believe that this person that's your close friend that you trust and have enough personal experience of to generally want to believe, right, would be capable of this sort of thing. But there's evidence suggesting that they did it, right? So I guess Feldman's way out of here is to sort of, again, try to distinguish the moral dimension from the epistemic dimension and say, look, I mean, maybe from an epistemic point of view, if the evidence really does point toward their guilt, then that's what you ought to believe if you want to be epistemically justified, if you want to be rational in that sense, right? But from the standpoint of loyalty to a friend, right, if it's a moral question, right, and the consequences of not being loyal to your friend, let's suppose, would be the loss of the friendship. Like the friend finds out that you talk to the police or whatever. There could be some moral fallout, right? Things that would harm the relationship. That's kind of harm. So I don't know if it's as satisfying to people or people like it or not. I mean, I get the idea of, well, maybe in this case we need to suspend judgment because it seems kind of safe, but I think the idea is that the evidence is pulling you in one direction, but your commitment to your friend makes you want to go in this other way. So they're kind of coming apart. This is sort of the way I'm reading it. Well,
It's kind of ambiguous too. I mean, just reading it to me is ambiguous.
yeah, I mean,
You don't really have enough to know.
Yeah.
You might know your friend.
Right.
You know your friend. The evidence may prove that you have says that your friend wouldn't do this, but do you really actually know your friend?
yeah. I mean, in fairness to the example, it's maybe a bit underdescribed in part just to kind of generate this tension. You might want to say, well, that's the thing to say. The example's underdescribed, and how good is the evidence that they've got? Do they have fingerprints? Is there video footage of this? Then it's like, I'm sorry that we were really great friends, but you're going to jail, and we can try to stay friends, or whatever. I don't know. So you might need more evidence. I agree. I think that could make a difference there. So whether everybody's really convinced by this idea of sort of separating out these different senses of ought or should, I don't know. I mean, it's for you to think about. I'm tempted to go that way, to think that, and to try to remain a bit neutral on whether or not beliefs themselves have a moral dimension, though I'm open to the idea, in part because I just got some concerns about the morality of things that might not be up to your control or up to you in the relevant sense. But that takes us into other questions, right? For those that are interested, though, this whole debate over whether or not beliefs are voluntary, it's called doxastic voluntarism, is the sort of the topic there. So if that's something you like and you want to see what people are saying about the voluntaristic belief, that would be a suitable topic, I think, for a final paper. There's a lot of literature out there on that. All right, so on to I'm just trying to move us forward here because there's a lot of different stuff. So the regress argument, all of this starts over on 49, right? And it's spelled in notes. This is kind of an old and useful way of organizing theories of the structure of our justification. So we're talking about epistemic justification now, kind of getting away from worries about practical or self-interested senses of ought or moral, ethical ones, just thinking about epistemic justification. And, here's one way to think about it. For any belief that you've got right now, if someone were to ask you what your justification for that belief is, hopefully you'd have something to say, right? And it might be another belief or collection of beliefs, or it might be some experiences that you're having, right? Whether remembered or present, a current conscious experience. But presumably there'd be something that you'd be able to say in response to the question, how do you know? Or more specifically, right? What's your justification? What's your reason? But you don't have to reflect on that idea for very long before you realize that, but wait a minute, I mean, somebody can then ask that same thing about whatever you say, right? So okay, great. So what's your justification for believing that? And what's your justification for believing whatever you're going to say back? So, and this has the kind of quality to it that you might, it'll resonate with you later on when we talk about skepticism, because sometimes you feel that way with certain sorts of skeptics. For any putative response or answer you give them, they're like that 5-year-old kid who just keeps asking why, right? And they just won't quit. So in any case, this is a way of organizing and thinking about the question of the structure of our justification, and it seems like there are only a finite number of different ways that things can go in terms of evidential chains, right? So there's some terminology we've got to get out here in order to talk about this. We're going to refer to basic beliefs or non-inferential beliefs and distinguish them from non-basic or inferred beliefs. What is a basic belief? And again, we're not assuming here that there are such things, because that's part of the puzzle, is whether or not foundationalism is true. If you're foundationalist about the structure of our justification, and some people, just so you know, will talk about foundationalism, about knowledge, the idea that knowledge has foundations. As long as we're clear, it doesn't bother me one way or the other, but personally, I like to think about this as a question about justification more than knowledge. But in the later part of the 20th century, and even nowadays, sometimes people say, well, foundationalism's been refuted. The idea of knowledge as foundations is passé. I'm not so sure. We'll see. But in any case, so what would a basic belief be? Well, let's just define it here. It's like a stipulative definition, right? B is a justified basic belief. What that is, by definition, is a justified belief, but it's not justified on the basis of any other beliefs, that is. That's what a basic belief would be. Whether there are any, as I say, remains to be seen. So here's an argument that'll sort of help us categorize, classify the different possibilities. The so-called regress argument. So either there are justified basic beliefs, or each justified belief has an evidential chain. So what are these evidential chains? Well, these are just sequences going back of beliefs, right? So again, if you've got, start with B1. What's my justification for B1? Well, let's suppose it's B2. Oh, great. What's your justification for B2? Well, that could be B3 and B4. And you see where this is going, right? So from a visual standpoint, there are only going to be, it seems, a handful of ways that this could end, right? One, just to kind of lay it out quickly, one way would be for it just to go back forever. It's just reasons are unending, right, and non-repeating. They just go on back. They're infinite. That's a view called infinitism. Feldman puts a little blurb in there, like a half a sentence or something, acknowledging it. Not a view that's traditionally been a favorite, but it has been defended pretty recently by an epistemologist named Peter Klein, who's at Rutgers, and he came here to UNCG not too awful long ago, and gave talk and talked about infinitism. So if you're interested in that, that's a possibility. But in any case, so it could just go back forever, right? Or it could be that the evidential chain, as you start tracing this thing, it just becomes like a giant web, and ultimately, or a big loop, right, is really the kind of idea. That's a kind of coherentist sort of picture, right? That small circles are bad, but big circles are okay. So that's me being kind of mean-spirited to the coherentist, but you get the idea at least. So either it goes back forever, or this thing kind of becomes a web or a giant loop, right? Or it could go back, right, and there just be things that are not justified at all at the base of it all. Maybe that'd be bad news. And then the final possibility is it goes back however long, but eventually you get to something, let's just suppose we skip a little bit here, and eventually we get to, B sub n, whatever that is. I'll just call this FB for foundational belief, basic belief. Suppose it eventually gets back to this. This is the stopping point. For those who have recently had intro to philosophy or are familiar with the cosmological argument, the first cause argument, right? Similar kind of reasoning that Aquinas makes use of in that argument, the idea that, well, look, if every physical thing has a cause, then there are only a couple different ways these chains can end up. Either they just go back forever, that's no good, or the thing causes itself, but that's incoherent, self-causation makes no sense. So there must be something that stops the regress, that blocks all of this, that causes everything else but isn't itself caused. So there's a little bit of a parallel. These regress arguments come up in lots of different areas in philosophy, and they're fun to think about. So in any case, here's a formal spelling out. And I will say, just since it pops into my mind here, you'll notice that Feldman really likes to try to take he'll say an argument in prose form. He'll just write the argument. But then he'll also say, now let's consider a formal version of it. Or he'll so he gives you both the English prose version and a kind of nicely set out, more formal version of it. I really appreciate that kind of thing myself in people's writing, just so you know. And since at some point here we'll have to start thinking about the final paper, not a bad thing to try to incorporate into your final paper. So if you've got an objection to some theory or whatever, try to state it as an argument. Try to say what it is, explain it. That's the sort of setting the stage. But then also give us a formal statement. And the reason why is because then it makes it easy to refer back to the individual premises. It also makes it easy to see what's going on in the argument. Because Because otherwise, if it's all done just at the prose level, you could have implicit premises or suppressed premises. Things get kind of murky. So in any case, so either the justified basics or each justified belief has an evidential chain that either A, terminates in an unjustified, is an infinite regress of beliefs, or is circular. Right? Advocates of coherentism would prefer web-like, I think, to circular, but in any case. So then you just knock out the ones that you think are not on the table. So if it can't terminate in an unjustified belief, because after all, how could something that's not justified transmit justification? It's kind of intuitive thing there. And if an infinite regress can't be justifying for some reason, you have to figure that out. And if circularity is off the table, then it looks like they're going to be justified basic beliefs. So this is kind of argument for foundationalism, but it also helps us organize the different possibilities. So here they are. The foundationalist buys the argument. Now, in terms of evaluating arguments, those that have had me before know this already, but for folks that haven't, always nice to kind of, again, in thinking ahead toward the paper and what I'd kind of like to see in the paper, evaluate the argument for us, right? Tell us, is the argument valid, or is it an inductive argument, a cogent argument? If it's a valid argument, that means that if all the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. It'd be impossible for the conclusion to be true while the premise is false, right? So once you've done that part, then you want to say, okay, let's think about the premises. Are they all reasonable for us to believe? And discuss each one of them, right? So if this argument's a good argument, then you're a foundationalist. If you think, hey, I can't get out of it, looks like I'm stuck with foundationalism. If, on the other hand, you reject 4, you think that, well, again, and this is what he's going to consider in sort of the second half or the middle part of the chapter, right? The idea of the coherence theory. Then, well, maybe there's a way in which, in some sense, every belief does kind of contribute to its own justification, but it's okay. It's not bad or horribly circular because it's a large enough web that everything's kind of fitting into, right? That's reinforcing. And then finally, I guess you could be a skeptic, right? That's on the table, as well as infinitism and terminating in unjustified beliefs. But skepticism would just reject the first premise, say, well, look, there just aren't any justified beliefs, period. So, before I get into sort of developing foundationalism in a little more detail, questions about the regress argument or thoughts on it?
So, do you have to look at it as prima facie reasoning justification for something with your premise 1?
Yeah. Say again?
Yeah. So you basically have to say your justified basic beliefs. That's prima facie justification, or how do you justify that?
How do you get justified in premise 1?
Yeah.
Well, we're starting with the standard view.
Okay.
As part of, again, we're not assuming that it's true, and it might turn out at the end of the day that chunks or portions of the standard view need to be revised, right? We're leaving it open, but as a provisional kind of, idea, start with the standard view that we know a fair amount of stuff, and that our basic sources of knowledge are the ones we've covered, right? And then explore the implications of the standard view. So to reject one out, I guess my question to you is, are you saying, does the argument wrongly assume that we can put premise 1 out there? Isn't that begging the question against the skeptic or something?
What a basic belief is, because I'm trying to see so basic if the whole argument to me hinges on a basic belief.
Yeah.
But how, is it self-evident? Is that basically self-evident, prima facie reasoning? How do you get?
Oh, so okay. Well, let me move. Yeah, let me go to the next thing. Maybe this will help. Thanks, Corey. All right. So here are some questions, and you guys help me. Help me help you. So generic foundationalism is going to involve two claims, right? First, that there are these justified basic beliefs, and we're going to get to what they are and what makes them justified, and is it plausible. And then secondly, that all the non-basics, the inferred beliefs, right? They get their justification. They're justified in virtue of their connection to the basics. So see if I can get the eraser out here. So the idea is it's kind of, think of it as kind of like a tree structure. I was going to try to draw it, but then I thought, no, my skills in that area are bad. So basically you've got these beliefs up the higher level, right? Further out in the branches. These are sort of the superstructure. And those beliefs are justified, let's suppose, but they're justified in virtue of their connections to beliefs further down. I'm not trying to suggest here that there's a middle ground between the two, so the picture may be a little bit misleading, like somehow there's some vague area where it's neither basic nor inferred. I mean, the basics are basic for a reason, but it might be that some inferred beliefs, some of the non-basic beliefs are sitting further out, as it were. They're further from experience. So beliefs about the current state of theoretical physics, right? What's going on there, the bleeding edge of scientific theorizing, right? Those are pretty far out in many cases. Whereas, maybe your belief that, there's a cup on the table, that's pretty tied to experience. It's not that belief's not basic. We'll see why, but it's pretty close. So I'm just wanting to have some wiggle room there, and partly to try to address your question, see if we can get it clear here. So those are the two sort of basic assumptions, right? That we've got that these justified basic beliefs are going to they're the foundation that everything depends on. Some people kind of have used this. There's a famous paper by Ernie Sosa called the Rafton Pyramid. And he sort of thinks of this as kind of that foundationalism. The picture is sort of an inverted pyramid, where you've got all the stuff kind of higher up, ultimately being justified by this sort of foundation of bedrock beliefs or basic beliefs. Right? So here's some questions, and this may be where you're headed. So see, which beliefs are the ones that are basic? We'd like to know that. What makes the basics basic? Right? And then what kind of connection to the ones that are so suppose we got just one basic belief right here, helping to justify all this stuff, transmitting justification up the chain, right? So here are the answers that the Cartesian, here's one version of foundationalism. Now, again, foundationalism has been the dominant view in the history of epistemology. You can find it in Plato and Aristotle, sort of the roots of this view. And certainly the early moderns, whether they're rationalists or empiricists, pretty much all foundationalists. Coherentism's kind of a late arrival on the scene. So for a long, long time, foundationalism's kind of been taken for granted. It's sort of the inherited account of the structure of our knowledge and justification, right? But there's different versions of foundationalism. So the version that Feldman sort of starts off with here, he gives it the label Cartesian foundationalism, kind of honorific, due to Descartes, right? And he's careful there to note that, well, this may not be, we're not doing Descartes scholarship. We're trying to sort of get a version of foundationalism that we can work with. So bear that in mind. And the reason I mention that is because in the second half of the 20th century, and even now, foundationalism's kind of become everybody's favorite target to attack. And in the same way that a lot of Descartes' views have kind of come under fire for a long time. And I mean, it's philosophy after all. People are going to disagree. That's what it's all about. And to some extent, it's all in good philosophic fun. But I think that foundationalism especially has been sort of a rallying cry for a lot of folks who are critical of different aspects of analytic philosophy to sort of just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, Descartes was wrong, or rejecting foundationalism. If you've read to the end of the chapter, then you know where Feldman's going with it, right? There's a kind of modest or moderate sort of approach. And it seems to me that, in fairness, those views need to be considered before we just conclude that foundationalism's dead and move on to whatever the proposed substitute is. So here's one way of spelling it all out, of sort of putting some meat on the bones of foundationalism. You call it Cartesian foundationalism. It's fine. So which ones are the basic beliefs? Well, you get elementary logical insights. Typically, when people set this stuff up, you get simple, obvious, logical truths. Mathematics is often thrown in because it's regarded as a priori, right? So you can think about that, right? Certain conceptual truths, no bachelor's married, all red things are colored, a thing can't be taller than itself, that kind of stuff. So some conceptual stuff, some logical stuff, some math, and then, but to really to the point, it's beliefs about your own inner states. These are the so-called appearance beliefs that get a kind of an airing in this chapter. So those are the ones that are, according to this version of foundationalism, that are basic. Beliefs about how one is appeared to, how things look from your point of view, but that don't make any claim to how they actually are. So, this isn't good English, right? It's not grammatically very good, but in a lot of the discussions that come up, you'll hear people say, well, I'm being appeared to cuppishly. What does that mean? Well, I'm being appeared to in the way that I would normally be appeared to if there were a cup out there stimulating my sensory receptors to have a certain visual experience. And that way of talking, that kind of adverbial speak of being appeared to treeishly or cuppishly, is helpful in part because it's to make it clear that we're not committing ourselves to there being anything. We're not saying what it is that's causing the experience, right? Why is that? Well, because, as we'll come to see, right, there are worries about whether we can, one, respond to the skeptic, the person who doesn't think we know what it is that's causing those experiences. It could be that it's a cup. We hope it's a cup. Could be Descartes' evil demon. Could be Putnam's, computer and the brain in the vat, or the matrix, or whatever. We'll talk about all that. So, in any case, those are the beliefs that are in question. These beliefs about how I'm appeared to, that don't make any claim to the way things actually are. What makes those beliefs basic according to the traditional Cartesian account? Well, that they're infallible is the traditional answer. Right? People say different things. They say incorrigible, that they're uncorrectable, unrevisable, rationally ungivable. I've heard people say that. Right? So indubitable, certain, some different things, and we can talk about those if people want to, but that's the answer that Feldman ultimately settles on for this version he wants to talk about is that what makes the basics basic is that they're infallible. Can't be wrong about them. So they're certain. Right. All right, what about the last question? What kind of connection do the basics have to the non-basics to the basics in order to be justified? Well, it's a deductive connection. We need to be able to deduce. So from logic and mathematics and statements only about your current sensory awareness, right, the way things seem to you to be, and it's easy to focus on the five senses because of the dominance of vision and the fact that it's easier to think about, but presumably it's not just sensory awareness. It could also include conceptual, one's awareness of one's own states of mind more generally. What thought you're thinking, right? So I'm having a certain visual experience right now as of a cup on the table, but I'm also thinking certain thoughts. And I'm not claiming that the thoughts are true, but only that at least I know those are the thoughts I'm thinking. We'll see that this all becomes problematic later on because in addition to the problem of the external world and coming to have knowledge of that, we might be on the cusp of a problem of the internal world, which is in fact where things have kind of headed. So let me go ahead and follow that one up with this one. We're getting there. Gradually just kind of narrowing down and getting us, being as specific as we can about it. So what are these appearance beliefs? Well, I've talked a little bit about them, but there's lots to say, and people, I hope, have questions. I would think you might. About the nature of these so-called appearance beliefs. A second question here for the Cartesian foundationalist, of course, is what do we mean by certainty? Is it a psychological thing or an epistemic thing? What's the difference between, what's the relevant sense? And clearly it needs to be infallibility. It needs to be that the beliefs can't be mistaken, rather than just that you can't bring yourself to doubt them. For any number of reasons, a person might be unable to entertain a doubt about a belief. Suppose you've been raised by a cult, you've been brainwashed, you're, the victim of post-hypnotic suggestion or whatever. Make the examples as exotic as you like. There are all kinds of different reasons, psychological reasons. Veldman gives an example, right, for why a person might not be able to bring him or herself to doubt a belief, but that's not enough to guarantee that it's basic, right? Because you could still be wrong. What we really are looking for here is something that can legitimately serve as a foundation for knowledge, right? And since knowledge always has to be directed at the truth, and there's no obvious connection between justification and truth, that connection is one that we've seen can be shattered through things like, or at least can get distorted in cases like the Gettier style examples, right? So it's going to have to be some kind of external thing going on there, right? Since knowledge needs to be directed at the truth, then it'd be nice if whatever it is that's going to do the work of the basics has a truth-preserving feature, it guarantees truth. All right. And then finally, this question here about the connection between the basics and the non-basics, and that it's got to be deductive. I need to say something about the external world. So we can take these in turn if people have questions. So how do people feel about this idea of appearance beliefs? Does that seem pretty clear? I hope. Yes, no, maybe. At least, the main thing, whether you are skeptical of them or skeptical that they can do the work the theory needs them to do, is to at least make sure you're clear on what they are and what they aren't, right? So I think the example involving the cup is pretty good, right? Because it seems like I can say I'm appeared to in a certain way without having to lay claim to the fact that the world really is that way. I can talk about just the realm of appearances, right? And my beliefs about those. Keep in mind that there's a difference between the appearances and a belief about one's appearances. Maybe I should do this just to make it, this can get confusing. All right. So, suppose at the lowest level, we've got appearances. How things look. Let's just stick with vision. Keep it simple, right? So, how you're appeared to. Sometimes when you're appeared to in certain ways, you're able to form beliefs about those things. I don't want to get committed to a principle that says every time there's an appearance, there's a corresponding appearance belief. That seems to me to be wrong. But at least in some cases, there are appearances, and then we're able to form appearance beliefs. So this would be the belief at this level. Right? And then this appearance belief that I believe that I'm appeared to cuppishly or whatever can then serve as the basis. This is a basic belief. This isn't a belief at all. This is an appearance. It's a different kind of conscious state. And then finally at the highest level up here, this is an external world belief. This is my belief that the cup is on the table. Probably should put it back over here, just so things work out. So here's the kind of the hierarchy. I'm getting that confused look. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. So like you said, the external world, that the cup is on the table. Is that what you're saying? It appears that the cup is on the table?
No. So here's the thing: the appearances are totally. That's not part of the external world. And this is where it gets misleading. Obviously, if there is an external world, and we're all in it the way we think we are, and you're having certain conscious experiences, then clearly your experiences, your conscious states are themselves part of the external world. Even though they're privately had just by you, they're still, because you're part of an external world.
So the basic,
right?
like it said there, I believe that it seems to be that it is raining, so
yeah.
That would be your basic statement?
Yeah, so Here's,
Like, yeah, I believe that
so,
it seems
yeah,
like-
this is awkward, right? I believe that it looks like it's raining, but that's just to make it clear that what the content of my belief here is a proposition about how things seem to me to be going. Whereas the content of my belief here is a proposition about things in the external world. Rain, trees, cups, whatever, right? So, I think I still want to make sure we're on the same page here. So we've got these appearances, which in some cases, if the theory ever is close to being on the right track, allow us to generate these appearance beliefs, these beliefs about just how things look, and then further we can infer from these, right, using, it's deductive, we're supposed to be able to infer beliefs about the external world. So this is a non-basic, just to make sure we get the, so we've got a non-basic belief, a basic belief, and this is just a conscious state. So it's just a mental state right here. That's the picture, at least, right? Whether it's going to be satisfactory or not remains to be seen. But I want to pause for a second and see if people give folks a chance to let it simmer. Yeah, Anthony, thanks.
So B2 is exemplifying the appearances.
This one right here? Yeah. So this is an appearance belief.
Okay.
Yeah.
And B1 would be the
This is this one right. Yeah, B1's up here.
I'm just getting.
Yeah. Let's make sure that's right. So just so it follows along. So this would be B1 in the overheads, and this would be B2, and this thing's not even mentioned in there. I kind of wish he'd said a little bit more about those. He could have if he wanted to, but in any case, he probably. For good reason. There was a lot of activity and interest in this stuff on appearances for a while, appearance states, and certainly part of the appeal, I think, was, at least in one point in time, the isolation objection to coherentism was something that was being discussed and written about. And so there was a question of whether or not coherence theorists might be able to marshal the resources of something like these kinds of mental states to help defend against this isolation objection, for better or for worse. But part of why I suspect Feldman doesn't want to say a whole lot about these is that he doesn't want to have to take a stand. He doesn't want to get committed. And also, it's really, it seems like we're starting to venture into philosophy of mind, philosophy of psychology, right? But interesting, a lot of interesting things to think about here. Not just immediate concerns about the viability of Cartesian foundationalism, but about the nature of these things, the ontological status of these things, their epistemic credentials, right? Especially if we're approaching a world, let's say, where we have, strong artificial intelligence, not just, something that can play chess or, do some voice recognition, but something that seems to be, fast approaching the level of actual sentience or awareness, then it would seem like these kinds of states would have to be part of those beings. Or at least something that plays the role of these kinds of states. So fun to think about, for people interested in AI and neural networks and all that sort of stuff. Kind of cool. So let me just say something about this while people are still thinking about this other stuff. So I want to be clear that when we talk about what it is that makes these basics basic, it's that it's not that we can't bring ourselves to doubt them. It's that they are infallible, right? That we can't be mistaken. And Feldman points out, and you might have it might have occurred to you that, well, just the sheer fact that a person can't be wrong about something doesn't seem to automatically mean they're justified in believing it. If some complicated mathematical claim just happened to pop in your head, and suppose it turned out to be a theorem that's a necessary truth, then you couldn't be wrong in believing it, but you'd hardly be justified. Right? You have no good reasons for thinking that it's true. So you have to keep that in mind. But at least the initial way of filling this out has it be that these things are ones we can't be mistaken about, that credential them. Now notice, I mean, they need not be necessary truths. I mean, suppose might turn out that you can't be wrong about what thought you're thinking. The content of the thought could be wrong, but not that you're thinking it. If you're inclined to go that way, which is very Cartesian intuition, then maybe that's something that you can't be mistaken about, but it's not a necessary truth that you're having that thought. Had things been a little different, you could have been having a different thought at that time. Right? And then the last little bit right here, the nature of the external world. So I'm understanding this, and this is again the way I interpret Descartes. Other people might disagree, but for our purposes, I take the external world to be everything beyond the immediate contents of your sensory experience, of your current sensory experience. So your brain isn't something that you're aware of. If it turns out that that's all that you are, right? Your conscious experience just is your current, neurological state or whatever, then there's a weird puzzle about that because you kind of recognize what's being generated, but you don't recognize the thing that's doing the generating. But in any case, certainly tables and chairs and all that sort of stuff, that's all squarely within the external world. Your body is part of the external world if you have one. The other people's bodies, all that stuff, external world. So, what do people think? Questions about any of this part before we look at objections? All right, we can go. We need to. I'll put the next one up here for us. All right, so Feldman discusses 3 different problems for Cartesian foundationalism. Not that there are only 3, there might be more. If you think there's a different problem that he doesn't mention, that he should have, that'd be a good paper. It doesn't, I mean, again, I like to think that some, that can be a real contribution, something small like that. It's small, but something like that would be, I think, make for an interesting paper because it shows a lot of thought has been put into trying to understand the theory and see whether it's right. Likewise, if you think that one of these objections isn't any good, you could come up with a proposal there and talk to me about it. That could be part of a final paper as well. So there's a lot of leeway there, depending on your interest and what strikes your fancy. I'd like to see people writing about things that interest them, rather than me trying to assign some articles that don't speak to you. So here are 3 kind of puzzles or problems, right? What if it turns out that these appearance beliefs aren't themselves infallible? If we can be wrong about not just the way things are in the world, but also wrong about the way things seem to us to be, then the view's in trouble, right? What if it turns out that there just aren't enough basic beliefs to do the work, right? If it turned out that there's only a small stock of them, but we need a lot more in order to be able to account for all the many things we think we're justified in, then that would be bad news, right? If it's just a few simple logical truths and math, which is great as far as it goes, but I mean, we're trying to get to the external world here, right? So we're going to need more than that. If it's just the cogito and some simple logical things, maybe a few little statements about your own current awareness when you happen to be reflecting on them that way, right? That's not very much. So maybe that there just simply aren't going to be enough. And then this final kind of worry is the connection between the basics and the non-basics, between the non-inferreds and the inferred beliefs. Maybe too restrictive. If it's going to be deductive, then that means you have to be able to literally get from your current beliefs about your current sensory experience and whatever rule of inference, probably modus ponens that you're using, you got to be able to infer these truths about the external world. You can't be mistaken. I mean, that doesn't look so promising. So I'll stop with that for now, and we'll go through each one of these in detail and get coherentism underway next time. Thanks, folks. I appreciate it.